Hello, in this discussion we're going to examine private military and security companies in U.S. foreign policy. We'll specifically look at conceptualizing PMSCs and identify explanations for their increased use. So why focus on a particular area of foreign policy instead of foreign policy decision-making or the process itself? Well, partly the course is designed to identify important contemporary issues, and I want you to be able to identify them. Next is quantitative political science research into argumentation. Specific foreign policies, I would argue, better allow us to leverage broad social science research to then apply to a policy versus the decision-making process, which does not have the same level of quantification. Specific topic areas can become areas of interest and a strength for remarkable skills. And finally, I want to focus on some of the writing skills. So why study PMFCs? Well, first, there's an extensive use of private security companies by the United States. Democratic countries lead the world in hiring and in operation of PMFCs, though that is starting to change, especially with China's increasing and changing complexity of laws and regulations of PMFCs and the use of foreign PMFCs in various projects. We also see extensive use by the UN, NGOs, transnational corporations, and other national governments all employ PMFCs. This is sadly apparent when we look at one of the most horrific attacks against UN personnel in South Sudan. Peacekeepers were called, they were less than a mile away, but they did not respond because of mandate issues. The first people on the scene of this particular attack 2 years ago was a private military and security company that was employed by an NGO. Now, that's not to say that PMFCs are good, bad, or otherwise. You will not hear that from me. This is recognition that as the world adopts these trends, there are things that we need to study and understand about their consequences. We think about policy implications. If you need to watch the link for Privatized War, this is a link of Eric Prince, who is the founder of Blackwater, which became XE, which became Academia, and which was purchased by another company, where he advocates for the privatization of the Afghan war. Now, that did not come to pass as a policy outcome, but we need to recognize that there are advocates and there are individuals in administrations who think of privatization as not necessarily a functional alternative, but as something that can augment U.S. force projection capability. Next, we think of the Wagner Group. This group, which is a Russian PMFC, attacked U.S. military installations in Syria. U.S. returned fire, even called the Russians and said, your people are attacking us, stop. And the Russians said, we have no personnel present. But it was a Russian PMFC. Worth the watch. Finally, there are many important questions about the privatization of force that need to be analyzed, whether it's the role and function of the state, the use of force, and then obviously the ethical implications of private-public good provision, of democratic and UN use, and the authority or force in the international system. Now, if we do a quick literature review, we think about military structure and force planning. Private security companies have been involved in this for decades. Biddle, Horowitz, and Posen are the three most important here where we think about it. There's debates on military effectiveness. So these are questions of what happens when PMFCs work in collaboration with professional militaries. Molly Dunnigan's work in particular, I think, is not the best, it's my favorite, say it that way, work in this topic, and she finds that PMFCs are going to detract from military effectiveness because of lack of coordination, differences in command and control, and the inability to effectively contract or regulate firms. There's also a quantitative literature that looks on the PMFC, on the effects on conflict outcomes. Avant and New, and Avant herself. I'm just going to say Elizabeth and Sedin again, so I don't mispronounce their names. They look specifically at some contracting. Peterson and then I all look at conflict outcomes. So what is a private military and security firm? First, private, not owned by government or government agencies. So this is not particularly difficult to conceptualize in the United States case, but there are countries, including Germany, where the line between government agency and private security company is more blurred because of the joint venture nature of the organization. They're military and security. These are firms that provide those sets of skills and services. And finally, these are companies. There's the assumption that they're rational, profit-maximizing entities, and that is an assumption. They can be individually owned, or I would say closed ownership, or publicly traded. There are kind of 4 ways to divide them. Think about armed and unarmed, so that's the first row. You have G4S, which at one point was the largest employer on the UK stock exchange. Let that sink in. At one point, the largest employer on the UK stock exchange was a private security company. So on the rows, you have armed and unarmed. Unarmed could be anything from surveillance, like Feminica's UAS support of the United Nations and the DRC. That's the drone that you see there. If you focus in, zoom in real close on that, there'll be a UN emblem on that. Also logistics support. So this could be providing clean clothes. This will also be intelligence services and translation, interrogation, communication, everything that it takes to make operations work. But you also have public and private divisions, or what I would call public and closed division. G4S is publicly traded, Feminica is publicly traded. On the right, so by column, on the right-hand column is individually or closed ownership firms. Now I picked all three of the 4 images in particular. If you look behind the G4S security personnel, actually it's not G4S, but it is a publicly traded company. What you see in the background is a United Kingdom power plant, a nuclear power plant. Their entire nuclear structure was protected by private security. On the right is Paul Bremer. He was the coalition provisional authority governor in Iraq following the invasion, and he's not protected by U.S. Marines. He's protected by Blackwater. It's a pretty interesting dynamic. I would argue that PMSCs can have a direct influence on conflict through military tactics and military support. Here you see a Predator drone and you see just logistical transportation. PMFCs may be able to have an indirect effect on conflict, whether it's a heart and mind campaign. Here you see sewage, public waste, public goods. There's tremendous evidence that provision of public goods has influence on conflicts, not necessarily provided by PMFCs, though there is evidence of that. There's also evidence that terrorist groups, part of the reason they provide public services is that it helps the overall population and wins support. The picture on the right is building of a school with an armed security guard provided by a PMFC. If we think about the categorization, like who or how they provide these services, Singer was the first major scholar to delve deep into this, or at least that's maybe where the literature starts it. We think about combat, consulting and training, and logistics. The way to conceptualize that, I guess I had point in the spear next. The way to conceptualize that is combat. There are differences between mercenaries and PMFCs, specific under international law, so according to the UN and international law. The main one to think about this is no offensive capabilities. It doesn't mean that they can't use force that looks offensive, right? Helicopter gunship, that seems an offensive use of force. What the international law stipulation is, and the distinction is that PMFCs have very strict rules of engagement and will be in defense only. Think about consulting and training. This is arguably the one that has the longest history. Actually, logistics support. Some scholars would take logistics support in PMFCs as we know them today, at least back to the American Civil War, when the Union was contracting for mules for movement capacity with companies. That's one difference we'll get to. Think about the rise in the market demand. Well, why are there a rise? And I don't have a good answer for that. Here are the main theories for it. Surplus of individuals with skills. So demobilizations following World War II, Korea, World War I to a degree. The Civil War saw lots of people with war skills coming to society and then not really being able to find anything. Following World War II, you had a massive surge. And so it's not, according to this argument, surprising that the first real recognizable modern PMFC was founded in 1956 to provide training for Saudi Arabian forces. It could be kind of this Reagan-Thatcher conservatism. Privatization of government in general, especially in the United States, accelerated in the Clinton administration with the changes in public policy and public expectations or thoughts. It could absolutely be. This is where you see the first government commissioned studies of PMFCs coming out in favor of privatization and not in favor. So there's both competing results that we see in the 90s. Could be that the Cold War hyper-militarization ended up providing avenues for tons of weapons and tons of people who have these skills. So if you've seen the movie Lord of War, it's based on Victor Bount, who's a real person who helped ship, largely illegally, tons of weapons, tens of tons of weapons from Soviet storage units, from former satellite countries, from the Balkans in particular, and into and around the Balkans and throughout Africa. This could absolutely be the case, right? So you think about demand, supply and demand. Once there's a huge supply, prices change and maybe there's demand. It could be that states lack the capacity for a quick change or for quick policies. And so privatization allowed for this. We think of this particularly in states where executive outcomes, I would argue, was a mercenary organization, not necessarily a PMFC, but a mercenary organization that was able to provide state capacity for in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in countries in failed states or failing states. The other and perhaps the most market-oriented explanation is that security privatization developed the same way that we see markets in other areas. There are inefficiencies in the market for security, aka states aren't providing it or they're not providing it effectively or efficiently. And so private actors started to develop, identify, and monetize what was once a state-only provided good because there were opportunities for it. I think all of these are interesting arguments. I'd like your thoughts on that. This is the slide on where they provide support. Tip of the spear, this is going to be combat. The shaft and the end are going to be military training and overall support. Think about where these are mostly located. So these are the headquarters. This is very old. This is from 2017, but Singer's kind of is where you start. So I think we start with his work. And this hasn't really changed that much. The U.S. and the United Kingdom and South Africa dominate the market, though Israel, Germany, and now China are increasingly active in the world. This map, also dated, shows 1991 to 2001 from Singer of where PMFC activity has been held. If we were to update this, it's basically just everywhere except Greenland, I guess. I don't think there's a country. I doubt where we can seriously say that I don't think there's going to be a country that hasn't seen PMFCs. We may debate on what a PMFC constitutes, for example. So if G4S is monitoring and provides airport security, should they be on this map? I would argue yes, because it's clearly a PMFC. Some people would argue no, because those aren't really the services that we care about most. When you review the private event security data set, or if you have a chance to review that data set, that helps solve some of the issues that I'm addressing here. Okay, so mercenary definitions. I'm not going to read through this, but mercenaries and PMFCs are not the same. I would argue they're not the same under international law. Mercenaries are illegal under international law and may not be used under any context. PMFCs are not illegal under international law and are frequently used. Now, that's not just my opinion. That's that the UN has organizations that have reviewed and examined mercenaries and PMFCs. So how do we think about some of the key differences quickly? A PMF or a PMFC, they are different, but we'll move through those quickly. One is going to be an organization. PMFCs are going to be publicly traded or closed ownership. There's a corporate structure. Who is making the money? It's not the mercenary, it's the company, and then the company pays the individual. That might seem small, but that is a huge distinction in how the stock market works and all kinds of other stuff works. Mercenaries are temporary, they're ad hoc groupings. The motives are different, so the profit motives, the organizing principle for PMFCs is corporate profit. Yeah, the individual who goes and works for them wants to profit as well and make money, but it's corporate profit. That's not the same with individual. It's short term. You're paid for 6 months. The moment that 6 months is up, you're out of there. It changes. Recruitment, it's public and legal for PMFCs. There's several pieces that look at chat boards and discussion boards exclusively for private security companies. If you look through how the U.S. government contracts, and I've got some of these contracts for Iraq, it was part of my dissertation research, we can see that they're going through the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. They're going through the same steps, right? So it's legal. It might not be right or moral. That's something else you can discuss, but it follows that process. Mercenaries, it doesn't. Services, this is perhaps the most important. Services for PMFCs are going to be defensive combat only, logistics and support. The moment that you hire a firm to conduct raids, for example, that's an offensive capability that would arguably be illegal under international law. Mercenaries do provide these others, so this slide I should update, but that we think about mercenaries almost in the exclusive offensive military capability. Right? They're going in, this is the example of executive outcomes, where they go in and they are completely outnumbered, but outgun the competition and are able to push back different rebel groups in different contexts. That's really not the role of a PMFC. Okay, that there are instances where that does happen in a battle, right? So a PMFC in particular is providing escort coverage, and they take fire and they return fire in an overwhelming manner. Some would argue that's an offensive use because it's overdone. Right? Those are where those debates happen. But mercenaries and PMFCs are not the same, though they may functionally and visually be similar. All right, I went a little long, but this is the introduction. Most of the material is covered in some of the readings that we discussed, but I want to make sure that we have this initial discussion so we all have the same base of knowledge. Thanks for listening. And as a reminder, as always, the non-audio, non-visual slides are available, so you can review them at your pacing. Thanks.